In the pre-dawn silence of Topkapi Palace in 1623, a scream tore through the marble corridors with such visceral terror that even the seasoned guards felt their blood run cold. It was not the cry of a woman in physical pain, nor the wail of grief that occasionally echoed through the imperial harem. This was something different, something that spoke of a soul being systematically dismantled. The scream belonged to 15-year-old Princess Fatma Sultan, granddaughter of Sultan Ahmed I, and what was happening to her that morning was not an isolated tragedy, but the beginning of a carefully orchestrated ritual that had traumatized generations of Ottoman princesses. Behind the gilded gates and silk curtains of the most powerful empire of its time lay a machinery of psychological torture so sophisticated, so thoroughly institutionalized, that it operated in plain sight while remaining invisible to history for centuries. This is the story of how empires didn't just conquer lands and peoples, but how they consumed their own daughters in the name of political stability and dynastic power. The Ottoman Empire at its zenith controlled 3 continents, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, from the steppes of Ukraine to the deserts of Yemen. It was a civilization of breathtaking cultural achievement, architectural marvels, and administrative sophistication. Yet within the heart of this empire, inside the sprawling complex of Topkapi Palace that overlooked the Bosphorus, existed a parallel world governed by rules that would seem incomprehensible to outsiders. The imperial harem was not merely a residence for the sultan's wives and concubines, as Western imagination often portrayed it, but a complex political institution where the fate of the empire could be decided. And within this institution, the sultan's daughters occupied a peculiar and tragic position. They were symbols of imperial prestige, living embodiments of Ottoman power, and simultaneously the most expendable pieces in the grand chess game of dynastic politics. Princess Fatma Sultan had spent her childhood in relative privilege within the harem's inner quarters, educated by the finest tutors, versed in poetry, music, and the intricate etiquette of court life. She was known among the harem women for her quick mind and her ability to compose verses that rivaled those of court poets twice her age. In the gardens of Topkapi, she had walked among fountains and roses, believing herself blessed by fortune and lineage. But in the winter of 1622, when she had just turned 15, her father, Sultan Osman II, summoned the chief eunuch and the mistress of the harem to his presence and informed them that Fatma would be married to Kara David Pasha, a military commander who had distinguished himself in the Persian campaigns. For Fatma, this announcement was not a joyous occasion, but the beginning of a descent into a carefully constructed nightmare. She understood what other princesses before her had learned, what whispered warnings had circulated through the harem for generations. Marriage for an Ottoman princess was not a union, but an obliteration. 3 months before the scheduled wedding, Fatma was removed from her familiar chambers and relocated to a separate pavilion within the harem complex, a building known among the servants by a name that was never spoken in official records, the Pavilion of Preparation. This was where the ritual called Tawil al-Mubarak, the Blessed Conditioning, would take place. The term itself was a euphemism so grotesque that it reveals the Ottoman elite's capacity for linguistic violence. There was nothing blessed about what happened within those walls. The ritual had evolved over 2 centuries, refined and systematized by generations of harem administrators who understood that the greatest threat to imperial stability was not external enemies, but the unpredictable will of highborn women who might resist their assigned roles. The conditioning process was designed to achieve a specific outcome: the complete psychological restructuring of a princess's identity, transforming her from an autonomous individual into a perfectly obedient instrument of dynastic policy. The first phase of the Tawil al-Mubarak focused on linguistic deprivation and behavioral reconditioning. Fatma was assigned 4 attendants, women specially trained in the techniques of psychological manipulation, who would be her only human contact for the next 12 weeks. From the moment she entered the pavilion of preparation, her right to speak freely was revoked. She was permitted to use only a restricted vocabulary of approximately 200 words, primarily terms of submission, agreement, and household service. Any attempt to express complex thoughts, to argue, to question, or to use the eloquent language she had mastered was met with immediate punishment. The punishments were carefully calibrated to avoid physical marks that might be visible on the wedding day, but they were no less brutal for their subtlety. Fatma would be placed in stress positions for hours, forced to kneel on rough stone while holding heavy vessels above her head until her arms trembled uncontrollably. She would be deprived of sleep through calculated interruptions, never allowed to rest for more than 2 hours at a time. Most devastating of all, she would be subjected to public humiliation exercises where she was forced to perform menial tasks in front of assembled harem women, including her father's concubines, whom she had once outranked. The second phase introduced what palace records euphemistically called mirror education. Tobrai, Fatma's chamber was lined with polished silver mirrors, forcing her to constantly confront her own image. But this was not an exercise in vanity. It was a technique of dissociation and self-surveillance. She was required to practice prescribed gestures, expressions, and postures for hours each day, while her attendants critiqued every movement. Her natural expressions were labeled as defects to be corrected. Her spontaneous smile was too wide, showing impertinent joy. Her thoughtful gaze was too direct, suggesting dangerous independence. Her graceful walk had too much confidence, implying self-importance. Hour after hour, day after day, she was made to rehearse the performed self that would replace her authentic identity. The mirrors became instruments of psychological warfare, turning her own reflection into an adversary, a constant reminder that she was being watched, evaluated, and found wanting. Former palace servants who later fled the Ottoman court and gave testimony to European diplomats described hearing princesses talking to themselves in these mirror chambers, sometimes pleading with their reflections, sometimes cursing them, sometimes falling into long silences broken only by weeping. Simultaneously, Fatma underwent what the palace administrators called hierarchical reorientation, a process designed to shatter her sense of noble identity. Despite being the Sultan's daughter, she was now required to serve others, particularly the very women who had once served her. Each morning, she was brought to the chambers of her father's favorite concubines, where she would perform the duties of a low-ranking servant, preparing their baths, arranging their garments, serving their meals, and sitting in silence while they discussed her as if she were not present. This inversion of hierarchy was psychologically devastating, a deliberate assault on her sense of self-worth and social position. The concubines, themselves products of the harem's brutal hierarchies, showed little mercy. Some had spent years climbing from slavery to positions of influence, and they understood that their own security depended on maintaining the system that had elevated them. They participated in Fatma's humiliation with enthusiasm, knowing that their cooperation ensured their own survival. One particularly detailed account from the diary of a Venetian merchant's wife who had contacts within the palace describes how Fatma was made to publicly acknowledge her worthlessness, reciting prescribed phrases of self-negation while kneeling before women who had once bowed to her. The third phase of conditioning introduced chemical elements to the psychological torture. Fatma's daily baths, a ritual that consumed hours each afternoon, were infused with substances that palace physicians had perfected over generations. The water contained extracts of opium poppies, carefully measured to induce a state of mental fog without causing visible intoxication. Mixed with these were compounds derived from henbane and mandrake, plants known since ancient times for their ability to induce suggestibility and reduce resistance. The baths also contained heavy perfumes, particularly musk and ambergris, in concentrations so intense that they caused disorientation and nausea. The combination of heat, pharmacological agents, and sensory overload created an altered state of consciousness in which Fatma became increasingly pliant and susceptible to suggestion. While she soaked in these chemical baths, her attendants would recite the litany of wifely duties, a monotonous chant that lasted for the entire duration of the bath, typically 2 to 3 hours. The repetition, combined with her altered mental state, functioned as a form of hypnotic programming, implanting behavioral scripts that would activate automatically in specific situations. The indoctrination sessions that followed the baths were perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated element of the entire conditioning process. Fatma was taken to a small, windowless chamber, illuminated only by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on the walls. The room's acoustics had been deliberately designed to amplify whispers and create an atmosphere of intimate conspiracy. Here, a specialist known as the Whisperer, always an older woman who had herself survived the conditioning process and subsequent marriage, would conduct sessions that blended maternal comfort with ideological programming. The Whisperer would hold Fatma close, stroking her hair with apparent tenderness while speaking in soft, hypnotic tones about the sacred duty of princesses, the honor of suffering for the dynasty, and the spiritual transcendence that came from complete self-abnegation. These sessions exploited Fatma's desperate need for human warmth and emotional connection, offering comfort only when she displayed complete acceptance of her fate. The Whisperer was skilled in identifying and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, shifting between nurturing and cold withdrawal to create an emotional dependency that further eroded Fatma's autonomy. As the wedding day approached, the conditioning intensified in ways that pushed Fatma to the edge of psychological collapse. She was now subjected to rehearsals of the wedding night itself, exercises so traumatic that some princesses never recovered from them. In a chamber set up to mimic the bridal suite, Fatma was dressed in the wedding garments and made to practice the rituals of consummation with a life-sized mannequin representing her future husband. Her attendants would narrate what would happen, describing in clinical detail the act she would be expected to perform and endure. She was taught specific phrases she must say, positions she must adopt, and responses she must exhibit, regardless of her actual feelings. Most disturbingly, she was trained to dissociate from her own experience, to mentally separate herself from her body and observe events as if from a distance. This technique, which palace records described as achieving the empty vessel state, was presented as a mercy, a way to endure the unendurable. In reality, it was the final step in her psychological dismantling, the moment when she learned to abandon her own consciousness as a survival mechanism. The physical preparations for the wedding were equally invasive and symbolic. In the final week before the ceremony, Fatma underwent a series of procedures that marked her body as a possessed territory. The traditional depilation rituals, common across Mediterranean cultures, were in the Ottoman context elevated to exercises in submission. Every hair below her eyebrows was removed using a paste made from sugar, lemon, and arsenic compounds that left her skin burning for days. Her body was scrubbed with coarse cloths until her skin was raw and sensitized. She was then covered in oils and unguents whose fragrances would mark her as claimed property. Her hands and feet were decorated with henna in patterns that, while beautiful to the uninformed observer, contained symbols understood within the harem as markers of ownership and submission. Most significantly, she was fitted with the bridal garments that concealed within their elaborate construction a series of physical constraints. The wedding dress, weighing over 30 pounds with its layers of silk, brocade, and jewels, was designed to restrict movement and induce physical exhaustion. Sewn into its interior structure were subtle restraints, tight bandaging around the torso that made deep breathing difficult, and a construction that made it nearly impossible to remove without assistance. While Fatma endured her conditioning, Her designated husband, Kara Davud Pasha, was receiving his own form of preparation, though the palace records are understandably less detailed about this aspect of the process. What can be reconstructed from scattered sources suggests that Pashas chosen to marry imperial princesses underwent briefings by senior court officials on how to manage their highborn wives. They were explicitly instructed that their primary duty was political control, not conjugal happiness. The Pasha was told that his wife might resist, might weep, might even attempt to refuse consummation, and he was given specific strategies for overcoming such resistance. These instructions, preserved in a fragmentary document discovered in the archives of a Pasha's family estate in the 19th century, are chilling in their calculated cruelty. The groom was advised to ignore any signs of distress, to interpret resistance as a test of his masculine authority, and to proceed with consummation regardless of his bride's state of mind. He was explicitly told that the wedding night served a political purpose beyond procreation. It was meant to definitively establish his dominance and her subjugation, setting the pattern for their entire married life. The wedding ceremony itself was a spectacular display of imperial power, with processions through Istanbul's streets, gifts distributed to the populace, and celebrations that lasted 3 days and nights. Foreign ambassadors sent detailed reports to their home governments describing the splendor. The princess, emerging from Topkapi Palace in a carriage covered in gold leaf, surrounded by hundreds of guards and attendants, her face hidden behind a veil so thick she could barely see. What these observers could not see was Fatma's state of mind as she was paraded through the city. Multiple accounts from harem servants who attended her during the procession describe her as being in a trance-like state, moving mechanically, responding to no one. One servant later testified that Fatma's lips were moving constantly beneath her veil, repeating the same phrase over and over: "I am the vessel, I am the vessel, I am empty, I am nothing." Indeed, this was the fruit of 3 months of psychological torture, a princess so thoroughly broken that she could no longer distinguish between the programmed responses and her own thoughts. The wedding night itself took place in a specially prepared mansion that had been designated as the couple's residence, located near the Suleymaniye Mosque in a district reserved for high-ranking officials. The mansion had been furnished with the finest goods the empire could provide, but the bridal chamber had been arranged according to specifications that had nothing to do with comfort or romance, and everything to do with control and surveillance. The room was designed so that senior harem officials, positioned in an adjacent chamber behind a screen of carved wood, could observe and listen to everything that transpired. This surveillance served multiple purposes: to ensure that the marriage was consummated, to verify the bride's virginity, and to confirm that the princess submitted appropriately to her new husband's authority. The presence of witnesses to such an intimate violation was justified through religious and legal arguments about the importance of establishing legitimate lineage. But its true function was as a final, devastating assault on the princess's dignity and autonomy. What happened in that chamber on the night of Fatma's wedding can be reconstructed from several sources, though the details are fragmentary and disturbing. The most detailed account comes from the confession of one of the harem officials who witnessed the event and who, near the end of her life, apparently overwhelmed by guilt, related what she had seen to a priest during a period when she briefly converted to Christianity. According to this account, Fatma entered the bridal chamber already in a state of extreme dissociation, her eyes unfocused, her movements automatic. When Kara Davud Pasha approached her and began the process of removing her elaborate garments, she did not resist, but neither did she respond. She remained rigid and silent, her body present, but her consciousness apparently fled to some internal refuge. The Pasha, following the instructions he had received, interpreted her passivity as acceptable compliance and proceeded with consummation. The witness reported that during this act, Fatma's face remained completely expressionless, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, her body limp. The only sound she made was a low, continuous humming, a tuneless drone that the witness described as the sound of a soul trying to leave its body. After the consummation was completed and verified, Fatma remained in the bed, unmoving and unresponsive, for several hours. When attendants tried to rouse her to perform the ritual bath required after consummation, she did not respond to verbal commands or physical touch. She had entered what palace physicians' notes described as shock mum, a state of profound psychological shock that manifested as selective mutism and catatonia. This condition was apparently so common among newly married princesses that there was a specific term for it in the palace medical lexicon. The treatment protocol was equally disturbing. The princess would be left alone in a darkened room for several days, during which time she was expected to reconcile herself to her new reality. Food and water would be provided, but no human contact or comfort was offered. The underlying philosophy was that the princess needed to understand that her old life was completely finished and that resistance was futile. The isolation was meant to force a final internal surrender, a psychological capitulation that would allow her to function in her new role as a pasha's wife. Fatma remained in this state of shock for 5 days following her wedding night. When she finally began to respond to external stimuli, she was not the person she had been. The young woman who had written poetry and laughed in the palace gardens was gone, replaced by someone who moved through the world like a sleepwalker. She spoke only when directly addressed, and then only in the limited, submissive vocabulary she had been taught during her conditioning. Her eyes, according to multiple observers, had changed most dramatically. They were described as empty, as if she was constantly looking at something no one else could see, or perhaps looking at nothing at all. A French merchant who was invited to a reception at her husband's mansion several months after the wedding wrote in his memoirs that Princess Fatma reminded him of the paintings of martyred saints he had seen in Italian churches, beautiful in form, but depicting someone whose spirit had already departed from their body. In the months and years that followed, Fatma experienced symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, including panic attacks, dissociative episodes, and periods of profound depression. Palace medical records, which survived in fragmentary form in the archives of the Ottoman Imperial Medical School, document repeated treatments for what physicians called female melancholia and nervous hysteria. These treatments typically involved more opium, forced baths, bloodletting, and continued isolation, none of which addressed the root cause of her suffering. Her husband, Kara Davud Pasha, proved to be precisely the type of domineering spouse the system had prepared him to be. He took multiple concubines, spent most of his time either at court or on military campaigns, and showed no interest in Fatma except as a symbol of his political status and as a vehicle for producing legitimate heirs. She bore him 3 children over the course of 7 years, though contemporary accounts suggest she showed little maternal attachment to any of them, her capacity for emotional connection having been so thoroughly damaged by her conditioning and its aftermath. What makes Fatma's story particularly heartbreaking is that scattered evidence suggests she retained some awareness of what had been done to her and occasionally struggled against it. A cache of private letters discovered in the 20th century, written by Fatma to her sister, who remained in the imperial harem, reveals moments of lucidity and anguish. In one letter, written approximately 2 years after her marriage, she describes a dream in which she is still the girl she used to be, composing poetry in the palace gardens. She writes, "When I woke, I wept, not for the dream, but for the waking, for I understand now that the dream was truth, and this waking life is the nightmare. They have made of me a puppet of flesh, and I perform my assigned movements with skill, but the strings are visible to me always, cutting into my hands, my throat, my heart." And in another letter, she asks her sister whether she too will be married soon, and if so, she offers advice that is both practical and devastating. Do not fight the drowning. When they push your head beneath the water, breathe it in quickly. The struggle only prolongs the agony. Fatma Sultan lived for 29 more years after her wedding night, dying at the age of 44 from what palace records vaguely describe as a wasting illness, likely some form of cancer or tuberculosis exacerbated by decades of psychological trauma and opium use. She never divorced, never remarried after her husband's death in battle, and never returned to live in the imperial palace despite being entitled to do so as a widowed princess. Her later years were spent in increasing isolation in a modest residence overlooking the Bosphorus, attended by only a handful of servants. Those servants later reported that she spent most of her time sitting by a window, looking out at the water, rarely speaking, sometimes writing in a journal that was burned upon her death by orders of the Sultan's chief vizier. We can only imagine what she might have recorded in those pages, what truths she might have preserved about her own destruction. The very erasure of that record is itself significant, suggesting that even in death, Fatma's authentic voice was too dangerous to be allowed to survive. The tragedy of Princess Fatma Sultan was not unique. The archival evidence, painstakingly reconstructed by historians working with fragmentary Ottoman records, reveals that dozens of imperial princesses endured similar fates over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Topkapi Palace archives contain medical records, financial accounts, and administrative notes that, when read carefully, expose a pattern of systematic psychological abuse. References to the Pavilion of Preparation appear in budget documents dating back to the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the mid-16th century, suggesting that the conditioning ritual had been formalized at least a generation before Fatma's time. Lists of expenditures for specialized attendants, pharmacological substances, and medical treatments for newly married princesses appear with disturbing regularity. The consistency of the language used across decades of documents suggests that this was not a series of isolated incidents but a standardized procedure, refined and passed down through generations of harem administrators. Individual cases that can be reconstructed from these scattered records reveal the full spectrum of how princesses responded to their conditioning and subsequent marriages. Some, like Fatma, survived physically but were psychologically destroyed, living out their years as hollow shells. Others did not survive at all. The case of Princess Aishi Sultan, married in 1610, is particularly tragic. According to a report from the chief palace physician, Aishi experienced such severe psychological distress following her wedding night that she developed what the document describes as brain fever within a week of her marriage. Modern medical historians interpreting these symptoms suggest she likely suffered a complete psychotic break. She became violent toward herself and others, had to be physically restrained, and died within 3 months, possibly from the combined effects of psychological trauma, the restraint methods used on her, and the toxic treatments prescribed by Ottoman physicians. Her death was officially attributed to natural causes, and her husband was quickly married to another princess, as if she had been a defective piece of equipment to be replaced. Other princesses attempted escape, though the archival record is understandably sparse on such politically sensitive matters. What evidence exists suggests that several princesses tried to flee their marriages in the early days or weeks, only to be captured and returned to their husbands' households. The consequences for attempted escape were severe and served as warnings to other princesses. One case that appears in multiple contemporary sources involves Princess Hanzadeh Sultan, who in 1616 attempted to return to the imperial palace only days after her wedding. She was intercepted by palace guards and brought before her father, Sultan Ahmed I. According to a report from the Venetian ambassador who heard the story from palace informants, the Sultan told his daughter that she no longer belonged to the imperial house, that her person and her future were now the property of her husband, and that if she attempted to flee again, she would be executed for bringing shame upon the dynasty. She was returned to her husband, and the historical record falls silent regarding her subsequent fate, which is itself perhaps the most telling detail of all. Some princesses found ways to resist that were more subtle and therefore more sustainable, though these small rebellions came at tremendous personal cost. Coded language in letters between princesses and their female relatives in the harem suggest networks of support and shared understanding. Certain phrases that appear repeatedly in these letters, seemingly innocuous discussions of flowers, gardens, and weather, have been interpreted by some historians as veiled references to their emotional states and survival strategies. A princess writing about a garden suffering from drought might be describing her own emotional desolation. One writing about a bird that stopped singing might be referencing her own imposed silence. These interpretations are necessarily speculative, but they align with what we know about how people living under oppressive systems develop covert methods of communication and mutual support. The very existence of such coded language suggests that these women retained some degree of agency and consciousness even as the system worked to obliterate both. The psychological impact of the conditioning and subsequent marriage extended beyond the individual princesses to affect the broader imperial family structure. Several sultans are recorded as having troubled relationships with their daughters after their marriages, marked by emotional distance and mutual avoidance. This pattern suggests that at some level the sultans understood the brutality of what they were inflicting on their own children, but felt unable or unwilling to change a system that served the empire's political needs. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position must have been substantial. A father had to simultaneously love his daughter as a parent and treat her as a political commodity to be traded and controlled. The records suggest that some sultans dealt with this dissonance by simply avoiding contact with their daughters once they were married, visiting them rarely, if at all, allowing the psychological distance to match the physical separation. The pashas who married these princesses also existed in a morally compromised position, though they had far more power and privilege than their wives. Some seem to have been genuinely troubled by their wives' suffering and attempted, within the constraints of their culture and position, to show kindness or at least minimize harm. Others embraced their role as domineering husbands with apparent enthusiasm, treating their imperial wives with cruelty that went beyond what the political situation required. The fragmentary evidence suggests that many pashas viewed their princess wives with a mixture of resentment and contempt. They resented being tied to women who had been so psychologically damaged that meaningful partnership was impossible. They resented the surveillance and control that the palace maintained over their households even after marriage. And perhaps they also resented the princesses themselves for being symbols of an imperial power that could dictate terms to even the most successful military commanders. This resentment often manifested in neglect, emotional abuse, and the deliberate taking of concubines and secondary wives as a way of demonstrating independence from the imperial household. The harem officials and attendants who administered the conditioning rituals occupy perhaps the most morally complex position in this entire system. These were women, often themselves products of the harem's hierarchies, who systematically tortured other women as part of their professional duties. Some may have genuinely believed they were preparing princesses for the realities they would face, that the conditioning was a necessary cruelty that would ultimately help the princesses survive their marriages. Others were simply following orders and ensuring their own survival in a system where showing mercy might be interpreted as disloyalty. The few testimonies we have from women who fled the palace and later spoke about their experiences reveal a range of attitudes. Some expressed genuine remorse for what they had done, while others seemed to view it as simply the way things were, no more questionable than any other palace procedure. This normalization of abuse, the ability to participate in systematic cruelty while maintaining one's own sense of moral integrity, is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire system. The religious justifications offered for these practices reveal the ways in which patriarchal interpretations of Islamic law were deployed to rationalize systematic abuse. While Islam, as practiced in many contexts, emphasized the importance of mutual respect and kindness in marriage, the specific interpretations promoted within the Ottoman palace constructed a theology of wifely submission that bordered on self-annihilation. Princesses were taught that their suffering was spiritually meritorious, that perfect obedience to their husbands was equivalent to perfect obedience to God, and that their value as women was measured entirely by their capacity for self-sacrifice. Religious scholars attached to the palace produced fatwas, religious opinions that legitimized even the most extreme aspects of the conditioning process. These fatwas argued that because the Sultan was God's shadow on earth, his decisions regarding his daughters' marriages were essentially divine commands, and therefore any preparation necessary to ensure successful marriages was by definition righteous. This theological framework made resistance not just politically dangerous, but spiritually transgressive, adding another layer of psychological pressure to already traumatized princesses. The economic dimensions of these marriages further illuminate their political function. When an Ottoman princess married, she received a dowry from the imperial treasury that was often staggeringly large, sometimes equivalent to the annual revenue of an entire province. This dowry served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the empire's wealth and power. It provided the princess with theoretically independent financial resources, and it bound the pasha husband to the imperial family through economic dependency. However, in practice, the princess often had little actual control over her own wealth. Her husband typically managed the financial assets, and the princess was expected to use her resources to support her husband's household and political ambitions. The irony is profound. These women received vast wealth as compensation for their suffering, but the wealth itself became another mechanism of control, another way to ensure their continued subordination to imperial priorities. The financial records show princesses funding their husbands' military campaigns, purchasing political favors for their husbands from the Sultan's court, and maintaining expensive households that served primarily to advertise their husbands' status. They were wealthy prisoners, their gold and jewels marking them as valuable captives rather than free women. The few cases of princesses who managed to exercise some degree of autonomy within this oppressive system are instructive because they reveal both the possibilities and limits of resistance. Princess Mihrima Sultan, daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, who lived in the mid-16th century, is often cited as an example of a powerful Ottoman princess who influenced politics and maintained her dignity despite marriage. However, careful examination of her life reveals that her relative autonomy came at significant cost and was deeply conditional. She was married at 17 to Rustem Pasha, the Grand Vizier, in a politically strategic alliance. While she did exercise political influence and maintained a high profile at court, contemporary accounts suggest that her marriage was marked by emotional distance and that she suffered from chronic health problems that some historians interpret as manifestations of psychological distress. She poured her energies into architectural patronage, commissioning mosques and charitable foundations, activities that were acceptable for a woman of her status and that allowed her some outlet for autonomous action. Yet even this limited autonomy was possible only because her husband died relatively early, and she spent her widowhood under the protection of her father, and later her brother, never remarrying. Her case suggests that even the most successful Ottoman princess lived within strict constraints and paid psychological costs that are difficult to fully measure from historical distance. The architectural and spatial organization of the residences assigned to married princesses reveals the physical manifestation of their imprisonment. These mansions, called palace houses or sarai, were smaller versions of Topkapi itself, with strict separation between male and female quarters, elaborate latticed windows that allowed inhabitants to see out without being seen, and limited connection to the surrounding city. The princesses' private quarters were typically located in the most interior and elevated section of the house, simultaneously privileged and imprisoned. She lived in beautiful rooms surrounded by fine objects, but she was also cut off from meaningful contact with the world beyond her household. Visitors were carefully screened, activities were monitored, and permission was required for even the simplest excursions outside the mansion. The architecture communicated a clear message. The princess was precious, valuable, to be protected and preserved, but also contained, controlled, and hidden from view. She was a treasure to be locked away, not a person to participate in public life. The children born to these traumatized princesses inherited complicated legacies. They were members of the imperial family with all the privileges and dangers that entailed, but they were also witnesses to their mother's suffering. Contemporary sources occasionally reference the children of princesses in ways that suggest they were aware of their mother's psychological damage and struggled with its implications. Some children seem to have been deeply protective of their mothers, while others distanced themselves, perhaps unable to bear witness to suffering they could not alleviate. The sons of these marriages often went on to successful military and administrative careers, their maternal imperial lineage providing significant advantages. The daughters faced their own challenges, knowing that they too might eventually be subjected to similar conditioning and marriage arrangements. In this way, trauma was transmitted across generations, with each generation of women learning to expect and accept suffering as an inevitable component of their elite status. Modern psychological understanding of trauma, dissociation, and post-traumatic stress disorder provides a framework for interpreting what these historical sources describe. The symptoms displayed by princesses like Fatma, the shock mum, the dissociative states, the chronic anxiety, and the depression are consistent with what we now understand happens to people who experience systematic abuse and violation. The conditioning process itself can be analyzed as a sophisticated program of psychological torture, hitting multiple pressure points known to be effective in breaking down individual identity and resistance. The use of isolation, sleep deprivation, humiliation, chemical sedation, and forced behavioral conditioning parallels techniques that have been identified in modern contexts as tools of brainwashing and psychological warfare. The expertise with which Ottoman palace officials implemented these techniques suggests they understood, at least intuitively, principles of human psychology that Western science would not formally articulate until centuries later. They may not have had the terminology of trauma or dissociation, but they understood how to systematically dismantle a person's psychological integrity. The erasure of these stories from official Ottoman histories is itself significant. The chronicles written by court historians, the official accounts of imperial marriages present only the public pageantry, the magnificent ceremonies, the generous dowries, the political advantages. The suffering of the princesses is entirely absent from these narratives, edited out as if it never occurred. This erasure was not accidental, but deliberate, part of a broader pattern of controlling the historical narrative to present the Ottoman Empire in the most favorable light. Empires, after all, are built not just through military conquest and political administration, but through the control of information and memory. By erasing the princess's suffering from the historical record, Ottoman officials sought to erase the evidence of their own systematic cruelty. That these stories can be recovered at all is due to the fragmentary survival of private documents, letters, medical records, and the testimonies of those who fled the system and were willing to speak about what they witnessed. The implications of these historical revelations extend beyond the Ottoman Empire to broader questions about power, gender, and institutional violence. The conditioning of Ottoman princesses represents an extreme case, but it illuminates patterns that appear in many patriarchal societies across history. The use of marriage as a political tool, the prioritization of male lineage and power over female autonomy and well-being, the institutional acceptance of violence against women when it serves state purposes, these are not unique to the Ottoman context. What makes the Ottoman case particularly striking is the sophistication and systematization of the abuse, the way it was institutionalized, refined, and passed down through generations as accepted practice. It challenges romantic notions about royal life and forces recognition that proximity to power does not necessarily mean possession of power, that the most privileged women in a society can simultaneously be among the most thoroughly controlled and victimized. For contemporary readers, these stories raise uncomfortable questions about complicity, resistance, and the normalization of cruelty. How did a society allow such systematic abuse to continue for generations? How did individuals participate in this system, either as perpetrators or as witnesses, while maintaining their own sense of moral integrity? What does it mean that some of history's most sophisticated and culturally accomplished civilizations were simultaneously capable of such refined cruelty toward their own daughters? These questions do not have simple answers, but they demand engagement. They require us to look unflinchingly at the human capacity for both brilliance and brutality, often existing side by side within the same culture, the same institution, even the same individual.